Okay. Right, okay. So are we all ready to go? Good. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to welcome members of our community here. What are you pointing at, sir? What are you pointing at? Hello? Are you pointing at your property? Yeah, okay. Sure. Members of our community, I'd like to welcome council members and staff. Chris Hannaford will run through the presentation. However, before I hand over to Chris, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands for the Kaurna people and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So this session has been convened for the purpose of briefing council members on strategic land use planning related to the future of the southern rural area. This session will be used solely for the purpose of information sharing and not for the purpose of debating issues, building consensus positions or otherwise discharging council's deliberative and decision-making functions. Members of our community are encouraged to listen to the information provided to council but refrain from general conversation or commentary that may cause disruption. I'm sure none of you will do that. Should the session become disruptive, well, we won't be going down that road because I know that none of you will be disrespectful. There is no set agenda and no minutes will be taken during this session. To limit disruption to the session, I'd ask people to turn their mobile phones onto silent. If you can, please. If you need to take a phone call, please take it outside and don't talk in the middle of a conversation in this auditorium. Please take it outside if you need to take a phone call, because I think that's a respectful thing to do. Subsequent to this information session, council members will be provided with a working draft version of both the Southern Rural Areas discussion paper and technical paper. A full desktop published version of each paper will be tabled at the IES committee meeting in October, which is the Infrastructure Environmental Services Committee. Should there be a requirement for this session to discuss any matters in confidence, that will not occur this evening. So now I'll hand over to Chris Hannaford, who's our strategic planner, and he will run through the presentation for us. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Mayor, councillors and members of the community. Andrew Goodsell will also do part of this investigation. But first of all, we have actioned a council resolution in February to develop a discussion paper. We have developed a package which includes the discussion paper, 5 fact sheets and a much more detailed technical paper. And the package is in more detail up there. The investigations to date include a discussion paper which is about 25 pages plus mapping, and there are 5 fact sheets for 5 key precincts in the area. There's also a technical paper which is more a background information paper, 66 pages, that'll have mapping and it's got an analysis of the 5 precincts. We've also done a project brief and an engagement plan, and as the Mayor said, the councillors will be provided with a copy of the discussion paper and technical paper. Essentially, over the next few months, we'd like the councillors to become familiar with the paper and eventually the papers will be used for initial engagement with the community. However, we're keen to actually work some common ground, not only with the community, but also with the state government. We're thinking that no code amendment has been very successful in this area because the council and the state government have been looking at different areas or having different policy positions. We're hoping that by 2024 we can use the discussion paper to test ideas with the community and develop a consultant brief so that we can actually start a code amendment, or at least the first parts of a code amendment. But first of all, I'd just like to talk about the actual history of the southern rural areas. And we've actually been working on this issue in council for 28 years, looking at the rural zone. I'm sure some people in here have been with it for that long. So in February, as I said, council resolved to do a report on the future of the rural zone. And in April, it was also resolved to look at more of the metrics around that so that we'd have timelines, we'd have precinct boundaries and engagement plan to inform future planning. All of that has been done. And the aim of this is to resolve some of those long-term issues. So we've done extensive analysis. We've gone through about 2,000 pages of council reports on this issue going back all that time. And we've tried to distill that into that discussion paper, looking at key reports, relevant state policy, looking at 5 key areas for further investigation. And we think in about 2024 that, well, early 2024, it's not that far away, we'll be ready to engage with the community, test those ideas. We've already consulted with the state government, who are Planning and Land Use Services, Renewal SA, who have a deal of land in the area, City of Playford, and we think there's some synergy between what we're proposing and what's being proposed in GARP, which is Greater Adelaide Regional Plan. That's out for consultation at the moment. The state government has authorised that plan. And eventually, 2025, these things take time, we think we should be able to have a code amendment in place after the state government has adopted its key positions. Now, the study area, which most people would be familiar with, covers about 1,600 hectares, a population of over 870 people. Standard subdivision size, or minimum subdivision size, is 4 hectares, except for the Cuddler affected area, where it's 0.9. And that has resulted in very small block sizes in the area, the smallest in the rural zone, down to about 1.4 hectares. And realistically, in that area, horticulture is much less viable, and there's a very good amount of dwellings. The area also has a train station, a significant piece of infrastructure. The southern rural areas, as we're all aware, are on the edge of our residential zones, and some parts of it are flood prone, and parts of it are also very good for horticulture. This is a quick slide on the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan.
Just one moment, Chris. Councillor Hennessy wanted to ask a question.
Chris, can you just explain where the Cuddler affected area is? I'm not very familiar, please.
Andrew will actually be looking at that. He's got a slide
so we'll
on
wait
that.
For that slide.
But that's in the area where essentially the railway line runs through the middle of.
Okay. We'll come to that. We'll come to that.
Actually, there you go. That's the Cuddler affected area.
We'll come to that slide.
Stebbin Heath Road, bounded by Stebbin Heath Road and Main North Road. So, and it's quite well identified in the discussion papers. The Greater Adelaide Regional Plan has been out for consultation since the 14th of August, so it's not very long. It's out for 12 weeks, and Council has actually organised a community information session on the 18th of September, and everybody's welcome to come to that. But that identifies 6 growth investigation areas, including Gawler, and Andrew will read out the detail of that, but it actually says the growth investigation area starts in Cuddler, moves northwards to Evanston and goes into Roseworthy. So they've identified
Councillor Koch wants to ask a question.
that it's a growth area.
Sorry, Chris.
Potentially, sure.
I'll just allow questions all the way through. Yeah, you go.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Through the Mayor. Chris, can you just explain what an interurban break is and how big that is and what it actually means?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think an interurban break is just another term for a green belt. But the Planning Minister, Nick Champion, has actually used the term green urban break. So, and he has specifically talked about it, and the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan talks about it as an area that separates Playford from Gawler. So there's some quite specific descriptions around interurban breaks, but we don't know how big it is, we don't know who owns it, etc. But I think that's part of this process over the next 12 months. We can help with the state government to define that and also define where it should be.
Did you have another question?
Yeah, I was just that when I looked at the GARP document, it had a couple of wiggly lines and it was very fuzzy to me.
It's just wiggly lines.
Just wiggly lines.
Yeah.
But then when I look at this report, it almost looks like there's going to be some urban sprawl through there. So I'm just a bit confused.
Okay. We will have a briefing by, who is it? It's John Stimpson is coming up from the Commission to talk to Council on the 13th of September, but we will also be having a community engagement on the 18th of September, which is a Monday, which goes into detail and will help inform Council's response back to the government. Yeah, another question?
Well, no, just the comment, the gap between Villawood and Gawler is 200 metres. And if that's an interurban break, I'd go he.
Well, we'll focus on the southern urban areas right now. We'll go back to Chris, and you can continue, Chris.
Thank you. Yes, it is an area of interest, and I'm sure there's lots of good policy debate, and we'll try to get a very good outcome for Gawler. But just to look at that Greater Adelaide Regional Plan, it focuses on the interurban breaks. It talks about living locally, which essentially talks about great livable communities, and it talks about Parkside, Norwood, North Adelaide, and they also mention Gawler because all the resources are here. There's something called a Metropolitan Open Space System in the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan, and that's been in the planning strategy in the past. The state government has brought that back. It was missed from a previous plan. And they also talk about urban greening, character areas, and supporting horticulture. We've mentioned that this Greater Adelaide Regional Plan is out for consultation till the 6th of November. There may be a slight extension, and we're seeking your views on the 18th of September, and those views will then flow into the council report of the 10th of October, which will talk about the southern rural areas and Greater Adelaide Regional Plan. So that's by way of timing, saying that actually what we're doing now with the southern rural areas is chiming very well with what we're planning to do on, or what the state government is doing on the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan. But we were also asked to look at what's happened in the past. That was a motion in April. And rather than going through everything that's happened from 1995 to now, I just make the comment that we've had a lot of planning studies, and the main thing has been that either the town of Gawler hasn't been on the same page with the state government on issues like green belts and rural living. But we may be moving towards some synergy in that area, in that we're actually getting closer together in policy positions. I'll just talk about a couple of foundation studies that illustrate this. The Southern Gawler Growth Options Study, with a wide variety of views on rural living and the rural zone, but there's a huge divergence of views between government and the community on open space and greenbelt. Study did not progress. If you go through all of those studies, they were either stopped at the early stages by council or the minister didn't progress the code amendment or the development plan amendment. I am thinking that we've actually got a degree of convergence at the moment. Just going back to the main study that people are familiar with, the Jensen Report 2015, there were a lot of people say, oh, Jensen's great, but they didn't look at the supply and demand analysis for rural living. They weren't aware, or they didn't take into full consideration that the state government was not in favour of rural living. They did not look at how businesses on Main North Road would fare. They were not focused on the Gawler River corridor, and they had a massive green belt in there on state government land. What we're thinking that has changed since 2015 is the electrification of the Gawler line in 2021. A lot more water recycling has come into the area. The Planning Commission and the Minister have both come out and strongly opposed rural living, so that while we have not been on the same page with the state government on rural living and green belts, the new state government position on the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan supports MOS, supports inter-urban breaks, supports living locally. I'm hoping that we are actually getting on the same page with the state government.
Councillor Kosh has another question. I'll just allow that question, Chris.
Through the mayor.
Is that okay?
Chris, when you talk about living locally, what sort of densities are you looking at?
Densities aren't a necessity in living locally. It's about access to services. You're not talking about rural living, though. You're talking about the densities that we've got in Gawler, that you've got in Prospect, that you've got in North Adelaide, that you've got in Norwood. So it's more about a livability than a density requirement.
Just on that, I'm looking at page 11, and it's got a little circle around Cuddler. Is this report suggesting that there's going to be dense urban growth around the Cuddler train station all the way to Main North Road?
No.
It's not?
Okay.
Those kinds of things are too far down the track to work on. We're looking at the broad scope of the area, and we want to engage with people.
So at the moment, you're looking at high level. Is that correct?
Pardon?
High level, strategic.
High level, and trying to actually break some deadlocks and not, I suppose, digging ourselves into a position where we end up fighting with the state government. But we can have different positions from the state government. There's no question about that. But we don't want to lock into too much at this stage. We're in a discussion paper process.
Do you want to keep moving, Chris?
Yes,
Councillor
I think
Davies.
Andrew, it's your
Councillor
turn.
Davies, you had a question?
Oh, yeah. So I was just interested in, I guess, the wording change around the inter-urban breaks. I guess, is this signifying that, because the greenbelt always meant, as far as I understand, greenbelts between the city and not the city, whereas this seems to indicate that we can have this kind of living as a metropolitan area, I'm just wondering about that change, because that seems...
We don't have much information around the interurban break, and I think that will come out with the consultation, and I think that we will, when we come together, when we get our briefing from John Stimpson, we will have questions that we may wish to ask John, but then also on the 18th of September we'll have our community with us together providing feedback on some questions around interurban breaks, etc. So I think that might tease out what we think, you know, is appropriate, and that may well be put into our submission to the state government. Yeah. So there may well be questions that we can ask that might be pertinent. Yeah. Andrew Goodsell, Head of Planning. Is that what, that's your role, isn't it?
More or less.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we've
Fire away, Andrew.
Fire away. I think I've been through this slide. Megan?
Yeah, we've done that slide.
There we go. Right. I think we've already covered this to a degree, but it's just for the purposes of being complete. One of the key landowners in the southern rural area is Renewal SA. There's been somewhat of a backwards and forwards with Renewal SA over the last 5 to 10 years, perhaps in terms of their appetite for the sale of the land. More recently, we know in discussions with Renewal SA that there are some bottlenecks in terms of SA water and sewering the area, given the scale of the land and the quantum of urban growth. These are, I guess, the realities of urban growth and managing that, which will have to get resolved. But clearly, they have significant land and their portfolio, and I guess their mission is about delivering urban growth. How we manage that will be the critical question, given that we may have aspirations for some aspects of their land as well, which we'll cover soon. This is somewhat of a variation or an adaptation of the work that Jensen did. So Jensen, back in the day, spent quite a bit of time talking about the areas around Hillie and suggested it should be a rural zone. That was done at a time when we hadn't mapped agricultural businesses, probably hadn't done the land capability mapping that's been done in the last 12 months. But I don't think fundamentally there's anything inappropriate about what they suggested. We've perhaps just changed the boundaries somewhat. These boundaries aren't hard and fast, as we've said. They're what we think might be a reasonable fit based on the information we have. And I know there'll be councils, as well as members of the community who have strong differing views, but I think it's something that can be tested. So that's basically what we have shown. Area 2, Cuddler, it's distinctly different in some ways from Hillie. There is less access to recycled water. There are no businesses shown in that area in terms of agriculture, which have been mapped by the RDA. We have no reports that have been done which say we should be trying to facilitate horticulture. There is a point in time where the land is so fragmented you just can't achieve horticulture, and our view at the moment at a professional level is that that probably is what's shown in Area 2. Having said that, we'll probably see some maps in a minute, but we think that Area 2 might be a combination of a deferred urban zone around the train station, because we just don't know what the detail of the final GARP's going to look like. We're in a discussion paper phase with that as well. We're not going to see the real GARP until 2024. But clearly the appetite of government and its urban investigation, we shouldn't necessarily be inconsistent with that. It's kind of counterintuitive to have rural living next to a train station. Equally, the areas which are more than 800 metres walking distance from the Cuddler station within Area 2, which may not be deferred urban, it may be some sort of rural neighbourhood zone or similar, and we have those zones. They're not purely residential, they're not rural living, they're somewhere in between, so they're lifestyle lots if you like. But that's some of the work we've got to test. Area 3 is different again. That's where the Renewal SA land is. That's where the larger land parcels are. And there are also clusters of commercial / pseudo-industrial land, which council inherited as part of boundary amalgamations back in the day. And finally, you've got the Area 4 Uliebury, which has got the sea gas pipeline, which largely makes urban growth difficult in that area. It's also in the foothills. It's near the Uliebury waste facility as well. there are a number of reasons why it's probably a distinctly different zone to Area 3.
Councillor Kosh, got a question?
Yeah, I have got a statement again, a question. One of the main issues with the wider Gawler community is about urban sprawl. When I look at that, all I see is urban sprawl. And that's the question I asked about
Yes.
allotment sizes. To me, that looks like urban sprawl. And I know that the wider community have been against that for as long as I can remember.
Would you like to provide a response, Andrew?
Through the chair, we might be looking at different maps. I don't understand the logic of that comment. Firstly, Area 1 is rural, which is horticulture. So Area 1's a substantial tract of land. We've said that should stay rural, which is clearly not residential, so it can't be sprawl. Area 4, we've said should stay rural as well. In fact, should probably have overlay controls that probably reduce division potential. So that's not urban either. We have said deferred urban in Cuddler Station, which is consistent with the GARP discussion paper, and we've said Area 3, urban investigation area. We haven't said what the zone shall be, but we also know from discussions around the room that we're supposed to have 15 to 20 years supply of employment land, which we don't have, that we have existing nodes of commercial retail development, and we probably need to sit down with those communities and work through those issues. So I don't think there's definitive zoning shown.
Councillor Kosh.
I just want to state that this has been an issue for the wider Gawler community for many, many years, the concern about urban sprawl. And when I look at the Cuddler affected area and around the station, it looks like urban sprawl to me. And then Area 3 again looks like urban sprawl to me. I think there'd be a very hard sell for the wider community to say that's not urban sprawl.
Well, I think I'll allow Andrew to keep going, and you might clarify some of those comments.
Thank you,
we'll keep
Andrew. So going through the document in a bit more detail, this is what we call our green map, if you like. So I guess the question was asked earlier about what is moss. I guess that's a $64 question. It was mentioned at least 10 to 15 times in the 2010 version of GARP, the 30-year plan. It was mentioned about a quarter of that amount in the 2017 document. It didn't have the status there, and it didn't seem to be the priority it was in 2010. And in 2023, here we are again talking about moss. I guess the question really is, what is moss? Is it the interurban break or is it something else? It's fair to say that government is doing further work on moss as to what they think it should be. We don't know whether it's the magic bullet, if you like, in terms of separation between here and Playford. It could be a component of it. There are bits of moss that make some sense. We've also got land south in Playford, as you can see on the ground when you drive through, and on aerial photography of greened areas. Is that sufficient for a buffer? Probably not. But we also have, if you like, the Jew land plus the lawn cemetery. They have de facto green space status. We've got, and suggested on the map, which you can see just to the western side of the yellow hatched area, some suggested active recreation areas which are on Renewal SA land. That to us would be to meet existing and future needs. That would be logically part of a green space approach. You could reasonably argue, as we have, that keeping a rural zoning, focusing on horticulture in Hillie is part of a green approach in terms of how we manage that landscape separation, as is what we do up in the Uliebury foothills. And also there's questions about how you design setbacks at any urban growth, if you had any, along Main North Road, which is Precinct 3. As I said, for those who wish to critique about we're promoting sprawl, we're not at that level of detail.
So you've got 8 dot points here. Can you explain that?
Yep, okay. So what we've talked about earlier, and Chris mentioned it quite well, I think, was that one of the gaps, I think, in the Jensen work is it wasn't part of the brief, to be fair to Jensen. There was no real regard to the corridor, which is the Gawler River itself. The open space corridor goes south of, at the moment, from our boundary, goes through Playford and follows down towards the coast, but we don't have open space designation along the Gawler River at all. So what we're suggesting here is if we had a proper and appropriately designed open space corridor along Gawler River, which is precinct number 5, that would serve a range of functions. Apart from biodiversity, it also does provide meaningful green land, if you like. On top of that, there's Carbethan Reserve, which, as you know, we've acquired more land on recently and is part of a network, I would argue. The Southern Sports Precinct 3 is the land I mentioned a minute ago, which is on Main North Road, directly northwest of the Renewal SA yellow hatched land. It just so happens that both sides of the road are Renewal SA land, but our suggestion to Renewal SA would be, if the Minister has mentioned a parkland, a northern parkland, that it could be where that number 3 is. Growth Investigation Area Precinct 3, there's potential even within a yellow hatched area to actually have linear green spaces within that, whether it be through creek lines or more substantially. And I take on board comments that Chris has made to me as well, even within the office, that you could design potentially some green space within that area which is hatched. It doesn't have to be necessarily urban development. It could be a mixture of some urban development and some larger green space components. On top of that, you've got the moss, which is generally, it's a little bit hard to follow, but it cuts a bit of a swathe really through Cuddler, and it ends up going through bits of Hillie as well to the river. Whether that's really achievable, whether it's going to work with a number of landowners, that's something of a $64 question. But as I said, Plus is doing further investigations on that. I think we'll know more probably in the new year on what moss might mean. And I've already mentioned the Dew land, which is on our southeast corner, down near the sea gas pipeline. And of course, you've got the land, which is the cemetery, which is a fairly significant green entry point as well. So I think it's a network of green spaces. It's not necessarily the whole valley as far as the eye can see being green, but I think it's a bit of a more nuanced approach as to how you balance managed growth with green. But that's an ongoing debate, as you know. My technology is... There we go. So Hillie. So this is the Hillie Precinct 1. There are some components of the Cuddler area within that, but that's based on the RDA mapping of where businesses are located. Will this please everyone? Almost certainly not. Does it displease everyone? Probably not. The reality is we'll have to work through that with landowners and see what is the best outcome on the ground. The argument with this area, at least, is we have land capability mapping and economic assessment mapping, which says that there is something here that's worth protecting.
Councillor Solomon.
Thank you, through the Mayor. I'm just wondering, the 2 wedges of Cuddler there that are shown in there that aren't shown in Jensen, is that just based on the RDA mapping, or is that also based on our support for the land capability study?
Both.
It's based on both? Okay.
Both.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Keep going.
All right. This is just a snapshot of the flood mapping. There is significant flood considerations to be had throughout the area. One of the issues really, though, it comes down to functional drainage. So it's a relatively flat landscape, as you can see, particularly in Hillie Cuddler. As we've been working through master planning of urban growth, that's been largely addressed in some of those areas. But if there was to be development in the areas we're talking about, in the southern rural areas, there would be a need to look at drainage, whether it be in roadsides or whether it be through other lowland features within the area. But it's just a flag that we need to look at flooding when we do any planning. Come on, technology. Here we go. This is a bit of a recap of what we discussed late last year, early this year, which was some of the mapping on businesses that exist in the area. And I know that there are those who think that some of those businesses perhaps aren't as significant as we do, but certainly the modelling suggests there's something like $13 million of gross product coming out of the area. And there are a number of businesses. And that's probably despite the fact we haven't done a lot of advocacy for them. And that's also despite the fact we haven't done a lot with state government or with SA Water in terms of being compelling as to the protected future of that land for rural land. Instead, we've had 30 years of debate about whether it should be rural or whether it should be something else. So this economic investment has happened despite, if you like, the vacuum on policy. Precinct 2 Cuddler. We would argue that this is fundamentally fragmented to the point that there can be no rural activity that would be able to actually operate there without being impacting adversely on residential existing neighbours or future residential neighbours. The degree of fragmentation is high. And also it's near assets which under state policy should be looked at in terms of a zoning which is efficient. Precinct 3, less fragmented than Precinct 2, has some landowners who would be definitely need to spend some time working through their priorities. We've got various drainage lines through that area. We have clusters of existing commercial industrial use. One end you've got concrete batching and electric vehicles racing around circuits, go-karts. At the other end you've got places that sell beds. And then you've also got farming land in between. So it's a little bit of mixture of everything. And I guess the real question is, given the lack of employment land we've got in the LGA, and I'll come back to you on that, but we don't have anywhere near the supply we need, but we did discuss that on a previous contentious matter. But putting that to one side, we have done work with a linear group, has modelled economic need, and we're at least 20 to 30 hectares short of what we need for employment land. So we'll talk about that a bit later, but there's definitely a need to look at how we plan for that future. The question is how. This is just a bit of a mock-up of what a rec reserve might look like in the southern area. 2 ovals, I think it had a skate park in there. It's certainly got multi-purpose courts. There may or may not be land swap arrangements in terms of land we already own versus land we would aspire for. These are matters beyond today's debate, but certainly we've got football clubs and other entities who have sites which are probably limited in terms of their capacity, and planning for the future would allow for those to actually have a more permanent home. And I think the Southern Sports Precinct would allow for that. It would also be consistent with the GARP discussion paper which said a northern recreational sports precinct. So I think this could potentially be that, possibly part of a green belt. And I said Gawler Foothills, that's Precinct 4. This is steeper land. There is some fragmentation in the northern end of it, as you can see, but certainly the bottom end is less so. But a lot of it is severely impacted by the setback required from the sea gas pipeline, which is quite substantial. And Gawler River. So Biodiversity Hotspot, it's referred to in various strategies as being significant. We have no open space along it. We probably need to be facilitating controlled and managed access, weed rehabilitation, working with the local community to manage this asset. And it's consistent with the historic branding that councils had about the rivers being important to sense of identity. So I think Precinct 5 is important. Moving forward from there, I guess we're seeking to solve long-term issues spanning decades of effort with little or no outcome. We generally concur with the GARP approach. We're part of a region. There is, if you like, at a state level, a need to address housing. We will be part of that. So I guess our argument is we're better to be managing that discussion to a degree rather than be managed for us, where we just say, no, we like what's happened for the last 28 years. I think what we've done in the last 28 years is just frustrate ourselves and probably frustrate our community as well, to some degree at least, even with the best of intentions. I think there's some key elements. We talked about the green belt, we've talked about the infrastructure that exists, the master planning opportunities that may exist in the future, but also fundamentally the need for an urban break. We talked about doing early engagement on this in 2024. We need to have some breathing space, I think, where we focus on our submission on GARP. So we'll have our workshops coming up in September, October, ultimately a submission that comes in after that. I did get an email today just for the benefit of the council, which did give us an extension of time. So whilst it is the 6th of November for a draft submission, I think the council meeting's the 21st of November, so they will let us do a final version substantially in accordance with the 6th of November submission. So they'll embargo the 6th of November submission, but that'll be the interim for our final. So we've got about a 2-week extension, more or less. And I think I've talked about the technical paper and where we are, but fundamentally, unless we do agree on a foundation that we need to manage growth, and we probably have to accept that we won't have a green belt that's everything that's rural at the moment, We're probably not going to be able to move forward with code amendments. We will struggle to brief anyone, and I think ultimately we'll end up with an aspiration which won't get support from the Minister. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Questions, elected members? Any questions? Councillor White.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Andrew, for the presentation. If you would be able to summarise for us as well as community the next steps from here, what we can expect over the coming months, coming 12 months. If you could summarise that, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
You had a slide. Do you want to
just double check if there's any more slides? I thought I was finished. Oh no, sorry.
There you
My apologies.
There you go.
I cut you all
There's
off.
an extra slide.
I wanted to hide everything from everyone.
And
in
that's
terms of
actually
timelines.
probably the most important slide,
The most
Andrew.
important slide. So
Yeah.
there you go. This might answer your question. I won't speak to it. You can read it. Oh, there you go.
So 5th of September is now.
Yep, so we're here now.
13th of September, council staff present the state government GARP, or the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan, with John Stimpson. He's one of the commissioners who's coming out. 18th of September, we've set up a community information forum, and that will be a workshop-style community forum, which will be run by council staff, I believe.
We're running 13th and 18th, so Q&A on the 13th with ask the hard questions of state government there, and 18th we're doing the presentation.
Yeah, and 10th of October is our Infrastructure and Environmental Services Committee, which is 10th of October, which is a Tuesday, and that's when a lot of background information, a lot of discussion paper, technical papers will be presented. Yeah, what?
So just on that point, so before members leave tonight, we've got a package of information which forms the basis of the agenda for the 10th of October. The intention at this stage is not to have that publicly available. At the same time, it's not a confidential document, but given the amount of information and the short time between now and the 10th, but also the concurrent process with the state government Greater Adelaide Regional Plan, we just felt that this was the right way to present information as soon as we could.
And on the 12th of December 2023, we'll have another Infrastructure and Environmental Services Committee meeting where we discuss the engagement plan, and we will be asked to endorse the engagement plan. That will go up to council probably in December, and we will be asked to endorse the engagement plan. So that slide's quite important. Oh, there's another one.
Here you go. I thought I'd finished, but I hadn't.
There's another one.
So there's a couple more just about timelines. So ultimately we, as been already indicated, we'll be going to the IES in December after we get to the October one. So there'll be, I guess, several months to digest everything we've talked about, and no doubt conversations to be had. We'll finalise our submission on GARP, which we talked about, and effectively from there we will be going to an engagement process with the community on the southern rural area, most likely in about Feb, because nothing happens in January. So
the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan will be endorsed late to 24?
Yeah, that's right. So the intention was that submissions by the 6th of November, but they'll get us to the 22nd of November for a final.
Yep.
They will do a report on what they heard, which will be early New Year, Jan, Feb, thereabouts. This is plus. And then that will lead into the actual GARP itself, so the actual 30-year plan, which you'd imagine will take the rest of the year, end of 2024.
Okay, that's good.
And I guess what we're saying is that in terms of this RA, given that where we are, have some clear air in terms of engagement.
Rural areas.
Southern rural areas.
Stop using acronyms, please.
Stop using acronyms. I will.
Thank you.
Southern rural areas. We will be in a position where we do our engagement in Feb, refine what comes out of that in terms of where the discussion paper needs to lead in terms of a final brief for a consultant, and then they will do the detailed work with the community thereafter, which we're in the middle of the year, middle of 2024, because that will lead to a whole lot of questions about what the zone should be, what the infrastructure needs to be, who's going to pay, because you're basically looking at a user pay system effectively in terms of how we do that. But with council taking the lead in terms of working out the prioritisation of which amendment goes first, because there's probably 5 amendments there.
Okay. Any other questions, Councillor Davies?
So the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan and all that, is this, from Gawler's perspective, are we just going to be dealing with this, or is this also going to be, are we going to be doubling up with Concordia stuff and all that kind of thing as well, or are we just dealing with this?
It's a good question. Basically, at the IES in October, I will give you a report on how all the various strategies connect. So, as we've briefed before, the Integrated Transport Plan will be going to market for a consultant in next week or 2.
And that'll be an integrated
transport plan.
Yeah.
Along with the 2046 growth framework, which is our 20-year framework. So if you like, the southern rural area is a smaller component of that 2046. So I would be taking the view that the planning on Concordia, which is going to take until late next year to end up in a code amendment that gets finalised. There'll be a lot of work going on in the meantime in terms of transport and other infrastructure, as we've been talking about in the chamber. That will occur parallel with the Integrated Transport Plan. Once we get our head around, because our modelling on integrated transport plan is going to include the assumptions on how Concordia will get developed in terms of where the access points will be, how our network will get used. So we can't plan for Gawler, but we're planning for Concordia basically. So that's what's going to happen, and therefore we'll have at least 3 or 4 balls in the air at once in terms of integrated transport plan, 2046, southern rural areas, and being a meaningful contributor to GARP.
Greater Adelaide
Regional Plan.
Thank you. Because
Sorry.
not everyone understands acronyms.
Sorry.
I don't understand acronyms.
Okay.
I prefer to use the actual words.
Yeah, it's fun.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'll go to Councillor Koch and then Councillor White.
Through you, Mayor, I just want to clarify, you said that user pays for the amendment and all the infrastructure. So we've got fragmented ownership. So is this relying on individual landholders in the different areas to group together to pay for the approval process, go through the whole system, and then put in all the infrastructure? Is that what we're saying?
What we're talking about when you read the technical findings paper, which you haven't had a chance to read because we haven't provided to you yet, but effectively what that says is that we have money in this year, 23-24 budget, which is around sort of $50,000-$55,000 from memory, which would be largely used on engagement with the community, the stakeholders in each of those precincts. It would be talking about what the zones might be and start doing a preliminary set of documentation for code amendments. But ultimately, there'll be a need for detailed planning on infrastructure, road upgrades, drainage, other assets. They will have costs attached to them. It might be that council continues through the budget process to be the driver, if you like, of the strategic planning and drive the code amendments itself, but with the idea we recoup our costs as part of land management agreements or general schemes under the Act or so forth. There's a number of different ways we can recoup our costs, but ultimately proponents should drive their own code amendments. If we have a deferred urban area, for example, around Cuddler Station, there's nothing saying to any landowner now or in the future couldn't say, look, I'm not going to wait 5 years to do this. Me and my neighbour, we're going to rezone our land for this. It's generally consistent with state policy, it's generally consistent with the discussion paper. We think we'll move forward with our land now. So there's different scenarios there as to how we do that.
Another question, Councillor Koch? Did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, that doesn't sound like orderly development to me, but anyway, I'll see how...
Councillor White?
Thanks, Mayor. Andrew, so the plan is that in October, we presented to IES a draft submission on the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan, which will then be submitted, or ideally be submitted, and then later in December we'll be voting on going to community consultation in regards to this is separate, is that right? I'm just trying to get my head around this properly. So our submission about the GARP will be different from the community consultation. Is there going to be community consultation about our submission to GARP, or is that a bit different?
Well, we're having a community forum on the 18th of September.
That's when it is. Okay, thank you. So in regards to the community consultation later in the year that will lead into early 2024, is that going to be on the documents that have just been provided tonight?
So wrapping up on the Adelaide Regional Plan, so we'll complete our submissions on that in November, like we discussed. We will be informed by the community engagement we do on the 18th of September when there's an open forum. But ultimately, the council will form a position as to what it thinks is appropriate. It may or may not have regard to what is in the discussion paper on southern rural areas. I'd like to hope that some aspects of that at least might inform what we think. But as I said, there separately will be a process as well where residents can go to Plus and they put their own submissions in about what they think on the Adelaide 30-year plan. That's what Plus intends. So that's why they're not offering to provide any more local sessions here. Basically, they're saying if you want to go to drop-in sessions, go out to 2 wells. So they're offering what they're offering.
We won't be getting a community forum from Plus.
That's correct.
Yeah, it will be a council member question and answer session, and on that basis we do the 18th of September, which is our community forum.
That's right.
And the submission to the state government on the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan will be late November.
Effectively.
Yep. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. Councillor Davies.
Which acronym is PLUS again?
Planning Land Use Services.
What was it? Planning Land Use Services Plus. Yeah, Plus. It does my head
That's
in.
opposed to the previous
It
group
really
that
does my
presented, which
head
was
in.
HIPDO. They came in recently, but we don't talk about who HIPDO are. It's just another government agency.
Yeah, Planning Land Use Services Plus. Who knows? Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Any other questions at this stage? Okay, I might wrap this up. Thank you, everyone, for coming and listening, and thank you, elected members. Thank you, staff, and everyone have a good evening. Thank you.